Hello, Dr. Lutzer. It's a pleasure and a delight to be with you tonight. I'm looking forward to a very stimulating conversation. So we are here tonight to talk about your book, We Will Not Be Silenced. I personally found this to be a fascinating read. I learned a lot of things that I think were quite compelling and fascinating and interesting in many areas which I was completely unfamiliar. So you really opened up an entire world for me. Any one of these chapters we could spend an entire hour on speaking, but I thought I would just open up the first 10 or 15 minutes for you to just kind of give what prompted you to write this, what were the concerns that you saw that you felt needed to be addressed, and how the book came to be.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me because, as you know, there aren't a lot of bookstores left. And so I'm so thankful for Baker and for the work that you do. And I do indeed want to thank you for inviting me and to all the guests who are with us. I wrote this book when I began to realize that the radical left in America does not believe that America can be fixed. America has to be destroyed, its institutions have to be destroyed and built upon a quasi-Marxist foundation. Now we need to distinguish classical Marxism, which primarily had to do with things such as the economy. And what happened, of course, is, you know, you have the revolutions in China and in Russia. Cultural Marxism says we can achieve a Marxist state. By that, we mean that we can achieve a situation in which we have Marxist principles and socialism, and we can do so incrementally. And eventually, people are going to like it because they see its benefits. We don't need a revolution like China and so forth and Russia. So what has happened in society, this is one of the reasons why you have the vilification of our Judeo-Christian heritage. Now, obviously, America isn't perfect, and I'm sure that many people who read the book or think about America, we always think of their imperfections, its imperfections. But at the same time, you know, I actually was born and raised in Canada, and I am a naturalized American citizen. And I don't know a lot about the Constitution, but I marvel at the wisdom that God gave, the separation of powers and so forth. But anyway, this is being vilified. Statues are being torn down, especially last year, and all this, because what is going to happen is the belief is we have to vilify the past in order that we might be able to build a better society. And on the other side of the revolution, you'll have an end of white supremacy, the end of racism, the end of, you know, income inequality, and so forth. And so the hope is to build a, quote, better America. But that's unfortunately not going to happen for reasons I'm sure we'll get into. So to quote the words of Schlesinger, who was a confidant of President Kennedy, he said very clearly that history is to a nation what memory is to a person. Now, Lewis, you and I know that if a person loses his memory, he doesn't know who he is and he becomes whatever people say he is. So what you do is you take in their view, take the imperfections of America, amplify those, be sure to minimize all of its good aspects so that we can find reason to have this kind of transformation of culture. Now, what I do is I apply it to race. And the reason that I do that is because Saul Alinsky here in Chicago saw, and he was a Marxist, he said he was, and he talked about the glories of Marxism. He saw that cultural Marxism could be applied to race. I spoke to a man who worked with Saul Alinsky, and Alinsky always said, don't solve problems, use them. This man said that we had some many good ideas as to how we could help the under-resourced communities in Chicago. And Saul Alinsky was against it because if you help the under-resourced communities, you're actually working against what he wanted to accomplish, namely a kind of revolution where the oppressed are able to overcome the oppressors. And you can't understand Marxism unless you realize that Marx, of course, the key to history was oppression. That's why he was anti-family. You know, the breakup of the nuclear family. Why? Men oppressed their wives, and parents oppressed their children. They took them to church, and God was the ultimate oppressor. So the belief was that what you have to do is to get rid of all that. And if the external oppression is taken away, people are finally going to live peacefully and so forth. So you defund the police and you leave criminals out on the street, because it is oppression that makes criminals. And then, of course, you get to what is known as critical race theory, but I have to hurry on. I also apply Marxism to freedom of speech. You know, there was a Marxist back in the 60s. I don't know how old you are, Louis, but I remember when he was still alive, back in the 60s, who said that if we allow freedom of speech, the capitalists are always going to win the argument, because remember, they are the oppressors. And so they will win the argument. They will use freedom of speech as a form of oppression. So it's time for the oppressed to speak. And this, of course, is applied. And that's why in universities today, it's so hard to get a conservative to speak, because after all, conservatives, they are the oppressors. And so it's time for the LGBTQ community and so forth, the oppressed, to have freedom, and the others don't. And then one of the most important chapters, and I don't know if you read the whole book or not, but it's on how propaganda works. I hope we can get into that tonight, and the destruction of the family. And then, of course, a chapter on socialism. But the main thing is this. After all, as a pastor here in the city of Chicago for 36 years, my heart is for the church. That's why every chapter ends with a response of the church, because I don't think it's right for us to simply analyze what is happening in society without us also saying, here are ideas, here's where we must stand in a culture that clearly has lost its way. So that gives you an overview of the book. And my desire always is to help the church to step to the plate so that we are not shamed into silence. That's why the title of the book is We'll Not Be Silenced, because I say in the book, you know, university students, by the way, one of the reasons also, Louis, I wrote it so that parents would understand, why is it that when I send my child to university, why does he or she come back hating America? What is being taught there? And one of the things that we have to do is to ask ourselves, how do we navigate in the midst of all of this? Now, it isn't easy, and I don't claim to have all the answers, but I wanted to lay out what the problem was, but anyway, I make this statement. Many students in our universities today will not be talked out of their faith, but they will be mocked out of their faith. And so what we have to do is to help them stand strong, even in the midst of opposition.
Thank you. Yeah, I did read the whole book, and I found it fascinating. You mentioned statues being torn down. The theory seems to what I'm hearing is that, well, statues are a way of honoring people, and why should we honor these guys who were slaveholders or, you know, abusive of, they were oppressors in that sense. So why shouldn't we tear down their statues? We did it with Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War, and no one seemed to have a problem with that.
Yeah, actually, I say in the book that I understand why many Black Americans believe that Confederate statues should be torn down. I was sympathetic to that because of what that represents. But when you begin to say that we have to even destroy the statues, by the way, of Abraham Lincoln, which seems strange to me, but also our founding fathers, you're really attacking the foundation of America. And you must understand that even though in the past, certainly America did not live up to its promise, the fact is that America has made a lot of progress in race relations. And I want to throw out a challenge to everyone who's listening today, Louis. I would like to challenge people to find a country in the world that is less racist than the United States. It has to be a democracy. It has to have large segments of different ethnicities. And you see if you can find one. I don't think that you can. So are we where we should be? Of course not. And we never will be as fallen people. But we have to ask the question, when it comes to critical race theory and stuff, there are different views because, social justice can be defined in different ways. But to get to the nub of the issue, Lewis, we have to stop shouting at one another across racial fences. And as Christians, we have to ask, what is it that unites us? Well, the answer is we are all created in the image of God and we are all sinners. We come to the foot of the cross and we receive God's forgiveness. And then we ask, what can we do together to make things better? But for us to constantly be blaming everything on one race or the other, back and forth, this is not getting us anywhere. And that's exactly the kinds of seeds that Saul Alinsky and others have planted.
You had a whole chapter on socialism, and I wanted to ask you if you thought that, because you were an advocate of capitalism. So do you think capitalism should be tied to Christianity?
Well, only in this sense. That's a very good question, by the way. I love to talk about socialism versus capitalism for this reason. Socialism says you don't own your money, by the way, the state owns it. And then the state divvies it out in accordance with fairness and income equality. In the mid-1980s, my wife and I were in the Soviet Union. That, of course, was long before the wall fell. And we discovered that doctors in hospitals were not paid much more than other people who worked in the hospital. Is it any wonder that they didn't have a lot of doctors? Now, so in socialism, the money belongs to the state and it divvies it out in fairness. Now, here's the thing, Lewis, and you can check on this. Socialists are always talking about how to divide up the funds and divide up the wealth. They never talk about creating wealth because socialism cannot create wealth. If I have a pie here and I divide it up equally so that we have fairness, and by the way, God is not a socialist. Jesus was not a socialist. We can prove that from the New Testament and the Bible. But anyway, if I divide up the pie equally, and then everybody has an equal piece, what do I do when there are no more pies? The only thing I can do is to print more money to make up for the pie, because socialism stifles ingenuity. It stifles all kinds of things. And, it's like Churchill said. He said, the great curse of capitalism is the unequal distribution of blessings, but the great benefit of socialism is the equal distribution of misery. One more thing, and then I want to answer your question very directly. And that is, we must recognize that socialism actually cannot work because it's totally contrary to human nature. There were kibbutz in Israel that said, we're going to run this kibbutz on the basis of socialism. Well, they discovered that some people brought their dogs into the dining room. They kept lights on that they didn't need. Why? It's all free. And they had to end the experiment because they discovered that it became a paradise for parasites. And that's what it does. Imagine having a guaranteed income. Now, in my book, I give examples of how in socialist countries, they produce goods that nobody wants, but it doesn't matter because you get paid the same. Now, in answer to your question, of course, Christianity can exist without capitalism. Christianity has had to exist throughout history with all kinds of monetary kinds of regimes and all that stuff. Of course it can. But here's the thing. Capitalism has given us here in America wealth. And Americans, and remember, I speak as someone who grew up in Canada, and I'm so glad that I've been welcomed here in the United States. But I have to say that Americans are very generous. They give $400 billion a year to charity. Now, Louis, I don't know where you've traveled to, but I've been in a number of different countries of the world. And, you can go to different countries. I've not been to Africa and India, but I've been to some of the other countries. Here's what you discover. Every Christian ministry, almost every Christian ministry, I'm sure that there are some exceptions, are all built on American funds. People come here, missionaries come here, you know this. We at Moody Church send out many missionaries, and what do? They come here to America to raise funds to do ministry throughout the world. And here's what I am concerned about. If we no longer are a capitalistic country, if we drift into socialism with all of those problems, which are horrendous, what we'll discover is that all that money that has been used for the glory of God and the expansion of the gospel will be gone. But will the church continue? Of course. But one of the most funny things about socialism is this. Socialism is based on need. Capitalism is based on greed. In my book, I show the opposite is true. But furthermore, think about this. Why would anyone think that greedy people are going to change once we have socialism? Socialism actually institutionalizes greed and makes deception and dishonesty necessary. In the communist countries that we visited, we found out that they couldn't live on what the state gave them. They developed ingenuity by having a whole shadow economy whereby they could live. So that's the problem with socialism. And I might end my little word here about socialism with this statement. Why is it that mice die in mousetraps? It's because they don't realize why the cheese is free.
Yeah, I remember reading that in your book. So you've painted this picture for us. You've described the radical left as trying to destroy America. Socialism is going to dry up the funds of the gospel church for the missions and stuff like that. So how do you respond to someone who says, well, Dr. Lutzer is really just kind of being an alarmist and he's overstating the case?
Well, thank you very much. I'm not an alarmist at all. You can read my book and I don't think you'll find a single conspiracy theory. Thank you very much. And that's why, Louis, for every single chapter, I give the response of the church. My suspicion is that those who call me an alarmist probably haven't read the book or they haven't read it very carefully, because I'm not an alarmist at all. If people can't see, and I hope, Louis, can we talk about the cancel culture?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So many things to talk about. But if people can't see that the culture is collapsing around us, then it's because they don't want to see it. And what has happened is people are blind to the reality because, once again, if I might quote Churchill, he says, the desire to believe something is much stronger than rational argument. And you remember George Orwell in 1984 said the most difficult thing for people to do is to see what is right in front of their face. So if you're not alarmed today, and you think that America is going to continue the way in which it has been continuing, I would think that you might be in for a very rude awakening. My book is not alarmist. As a matter of fact, you look at the endorsers, and one of the things that a lot of people have said is that it is very balanced. I try to take into account the concerns that people have, but at the same time to give a very scriptural response. And there is a time when people should be alarmist, and the Bible warns about times that should make us very alarmed, and we need to respond in that way.
Good, thank you. We've got some questions here from some of our listeners. I'll go ahead and give you this one because I think it dovetails nicely with what you were discussing here. How do we prevent or correct progressive drift in Christian colleges today?
Well, What happens is this. Thank you for asking the question. It all has to do, and I'm not an expert here, but I'm going to give my suggestion that I deeply believe. It all has to do with the board of the institutions. And when the board begins to cave in, when they begin to allow certain things into the university, thinking, oh, we'll know exactly where we can draw the line, they are making a mistake. Because what is going to happen is, once they begin to give a certain amount of credence to the LGBTQ community or the trans community, these groups will not be satisfied until they are totally accepted and have total dominance. And that has been proven again and again. I'm not going to mention any colleges here. I'll simply let that go. But I have seen that happen. So it's the responsibility of the board and this is critical, and the hiring of the faculty. I think that I think we ought to pray a lot for college presidents today of Christian colleges, because they need faculty that actually hold to the documents and the doctrinal statements that they are asked to sign. And I know a denomination right now that has a very evangelical, statement of faith, but nobody goes by it. Nobody looks at it. It's totally neglected. And so I think that's where it begins. It begins with the board making sure that the faculty that are hired and the direction of the school stays where it originally was supposed to be.
Okay. Another question here, along those same lines, but in a different context. How do we approach our church leadership to start discussing these topics?
What leadership?
How do we approach our church leadership to start discussing these topics?
Well, I would say, first of all, very carefully, it depends what church that you are going to. One of the things that I've had people ask me is this: my church lives in a bubble. All of these cultural issues, racism, the cultural issue of the LGBT agenda, all of these things are swirling around us, and they just keeping on like they did years ago, and nobody is addressing these issues. Now, as a pastor, I always believed it was my responsibility to make sure that I spoke to the issues, the controlling realities of our culture. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't expound books of the New Testament or the Old Testament. I did that, but I also took out time to speak to the controlling realities. That's, I think, my phrase, the controlling realities of the culture. But what do you do if you're in a church that is blindly buying into the world, perhaps not even knowing it? So here's my advice, and it actually comes from the lips of Jesus, so it isn't just my advice. The last chapter of my book is entitled Strengthen What Remains. It's the words of Jesus to the church in Sardis. Now, I've been to Sardis, and what you discover when you are there is that here is a church built right up next against a pagan temple. And this is a 3rd century church, so it's not the one that Jesus wrote the letter to. But isn't that interesting? How should we interpret that? Here's a church. Now, one way to interpret it is to say the church wanted to be where it is the darkest, where there was prostitution and all those things, to give a witness for the gospel. I hope that's the correct interpretation. The other interpretation is to say, no, the church actually felt at home there. And I find today that people are buying into the culture, and I am getting to an answer of your question there, but I have to say this: they're doing it, they're being deceived under the guise of love. They're saying, oh, we have to be loving, and so we have to accept, the diversification of marriage, the equality of marriage. Oh my. In my book, I discuss equality and justice, words that are so misused in today's culture. But they say that, and they don't realize that love can be very evil. When Adam and Eve, when they quit sinning when they sinned, I should say, in the garden. They didn't stop loving. They just started to love the wrong things, lovers of pleasure, lovers of money, lovers of themselves. Not everything that is loving is of God. Herein is love, that you keep my commandments. But anyway, back to your question. Isn't it interesting, Lewis, that in that letter where Jesus asks the church to repent because it no longer had seen the world as its enemy, that was the bottom line, Jesus said, I want you to repent. What does he say? He says, but there's still some names there in Sardis that you have who have not soiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. In your church, if you are in a church that has totally abdicated its responsibility, and yet maybe it's the only church you can attend, the only church, whatever, that does not mean that you as an individual cannot have an impact. You might be able to approach the board or the leadership to bring things to their attention, and maybe they will listen. It's possible that they won't, because things are what they are. But at the same time, you have to ask, what does faithfulness look like for me in the midst of my situation? People are always saying, what can I do? And I say, it depends on your situation. You know, the mother who's at home raising children, for her, faithfulness means one thing. For someone like me or you, Lewis, it means something else within our vocations and our calling. Maybe for somebody else, a businessman, faithfulness means that he is not going to give into the woke culture. He's not going to submit. He's not going to write a letter apologizing for the color of his skin, because he knows obviously that that is bogus. So the point is that everyone has to kind of draw a line and say, with Martin Luther, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. One quick illustration. A school teacher here in Chicago told me, he was told, it is not enough if you tolerate same-sex marriage, you must celebrate it or you will lose your job. Now that's a line in the sand. He cannot celebrate what God has condemned. So the question is he going to be willing to say, I will not submit to the culture, even if I lose my job? And then the other question is the rest of the church going to come around him and say, we are going to help you through this experience because you have paid a penalty, you've paid a price to be a follower of Christ and your convictions, and we're going to help you through this. So to the caller who asked, how do we approach the church leadership? Do it with humility. Don't be judgmental. Give them information, share your concerns, hope that they will begin to see things that need to be done. But at the same time, if that doesn't happen, you be faithful wherever God has planted you.
You mentioned passing in that answer made reference to a woke culture. Some of our listeners may not be familiar with that phrase. What does that mean and your take on it?
Well, actually, the word woke, of course, comes from awake. It's kind of a slang term, woke. And there's a good sense of being woke. Woke might mean us actually understanding the various cultural streams that are floating around us. So there's a good use of the word woke. You know, a book was written entitled The Woke Church. And but the way in which I'm using it has to do with understanding intersectionality, understanding critical race theory, understanding the cultural drift that is being used to keep us apart from racial standpoints and so forth. And of course, it is, and it's cancel culture. Let's take, for example, the baseball game, the All-Star game, which was supposed to be played there in Georgia. They moved it. Immediately, Coca-Cola said, we support that. So did the airline. I think it was Delta. Why? We all want to make sure that everybody knows that we are in agreement with a woke culture. Now, I wrote a book about Nazi Germany, and I discovered that there were German churches that put swastikas on the doors of their church, saying, in effect, when you come for the Christians, don't come for us because we are on your side. What you have in today's culture was perfected by the Soviet Union. It's called cultural demonization, collective demonization. That's the phrase that I want, where when one person was vilified, we would say deplatformed by the state, everyone else chimed in and they were saying, I agree with you and I want to be on the right side of history. And then, of course, you also have collective judgment and collective punishment and guilt. And that could lead us into some interesting discussion. So the question is that people are asking is, am I woke enough to be seen as virtuous? Because you're a racist, but not me. I'm woke. Let me speak very candidly here, Lewis, about the fact that what we need to do is to humble ourselves and see that all of us are sinners. All of us struggle with pride. We struggle with the desire to use other people for our own blessing. And that is not something unique to one race. Solzhenitsyn was so right when he said that the line between good and evil does not go between countries and races. It goes through every human heart. And all the people out there who are being so woke, trying to distance themselves from the struggle of other people, trying to feign their innocence for jumping on bandwagons, that I think is wrong and actually betrays a misunderstanding of their own nature, because all of us are fallen creatures and we all need the same Savior.
Okay, another question from one of our listeners. Do you believe a radical leftist ideology can fit within a Christian worldview?
A radical
leftist ideology.
I don't think so, but there's some definitions here. Leftist ideology. I need to tease that out a little bit to know exactly what is meant by that, because we throw these labels around. This person is left, and so forth. So I'm going to kind of beg off on that, because I don't know what they mean by leftist. Now, if they said Marxist, that would be a very clear answer. The answer would be no, for some very obvious reasons. But when it comes to leftism, I'm not sure. Now, here's the thing that we need to understand. The body of Christ has different points of view. And our Black African-American brothers and sisters, they look at things very differently. We learned this, of course. I learned this as a pastor of Moody Church than we do. So we need to be tolerant with one another. We need to try to understand one another. By the way, Lewis, could I ask you, what year did you attend Moody Bible Institute?
It was 1980 to 1983.
1980 to 1983. I was the pastor of Moody Church at that time.
You were. I went to your church at the time. Yeah.
All right. Now, here's the thing about Moody Church. I don't know how it was in the early 80s, but we were so grateful that on any Sunday morning, we had more than 70 different countries of origin represented in our morning service. And we did several different surveys to confirm that. Because I told the people we are readying ourselves for heaven, where there are going to be people from every tongue and nation and so forth represented around the throne. So we need to take into account the fact that we are going to have differences on this side or on that side. I want to speak to the issue, though, of systemic racism, since that's oftentimes, I think this, there are those, if you're on the left, everything is systemic racism. If you're on what we could call the right, it's all a matter of individuals. It's the individual's fault. And I'd like to suggest tonight that actually it is both. that what we need to do is, I'm not denying systemic racism. I talk to my brothers and sisters here in Chicago, and they can fill me in on what's happening, and I get that. But on the other hand, we cannot allow personal responsibility to go by the way simply because of systemic racism. In the book that we're talking about tonight, We Will Not Be Silenced, as you know, I quote an atheist by the name of Dalrymple, who was a doctor, who said that any culture, this is not a culturally judgmental statement. Show me a culture where there is 70% of illegitimacy, where there are no fathers in the home, and I will show you a culture that has drugs and crime and so forth. So there are things that we cannot fix that have to be fixed by individuals. But also, of course, we should work against those racial issues that impinge upon any community. And by the way, I'm not just speaking about the African American community, I'm talking about the white community too, because it's the breakup of the home. And that can't be fixed by government legislation or even the billions of dollars that our government seems to be so happy to want to create out of thin air.
Good. All right. Another question from our listener. What are your thoughts on what critical race theory is doing to our children in public schools?
Well, I can answer that quite easily. All that I need to do is to listen to the news. I have several stories that have come to me recently about children who were asked to confess the sin of their whiteness. You know, I read the book, it's entitled White Fragility. White Fragility is widely read. I think it was #1 at one time in terms of books. In my opinion, it is a very racist book, and it makes racism compulsory. Because what has to happen is, if you are white, you have certain marks against you and you have to confess it. And some of these kids didn't want to. They were shamed because of their whiteness, which of course is brought on by books like that. And so they had to stand against that, and their parents got involved. There are a number of different school systems where this is happening. And so what we need to do is to recognize that this is what the kids are up against. But another thing also comes to mind. You know, all this idea of pronouns. What is your pronoun? You know, do you want to be called a he? Do you want to be called a she? Do you want to be called a they? Lewis, this confusion is deliberate. It is intended to make us silent because we're afraid to open our mouths. We don't know who's a he, who's a she, who's a they. Did you know that there are moves now by our government to tell Christian schools that they need to accept transgender students? And if there's a man who is born a man biologically and he has transitioned to a woman, they have to be willing to put this, quote, woman into a same room with a girl who is born a girl and lives like a girl, because after all, we need equality. There's a lawsuit going on right now about that. So if people think that my book is, what was the word that was used, Lewis, that they thought
alarmist.
Was alarmist?
Yeah.
I have to tell you, it probably isn't alarmist enough. I don't want to put myself in the thing. I'm going to throw this in and somebody's going to criticize me for it, but that's okay. Noah preached for 120 years that it was going to rain. Talk about alarmist. It had never rained before that time. I mean, people were saying he is definitely buying into conspiracy theories. Well, all that you have to do is look around you. Remember Orwell, the most difficult thing for us to do is to see that which is in front of our face. So to all those of you who live in your little bubble who think that I'm an alarmist or that everything seems to be going along, I say with a smile and with love in my heart, wake up.
Okay, good question here. And I had Becky look up the verse for us since they referenced a Bible verse. How should we apply Ephesians 6:12 to help us achieve what you've written about in your book? And Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities."
Oh, yeah. What we need to understand is that people are not our enemy. I think I say that in the book. Our true enemy is Satan. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved with people, try to convince people, connect with people, because after all that matters is what happens in the spirit world. That's totally contrary to Christianity. Of course, we have to interact. We have to discuss these ideas. But we are naive if we think we can turn America around simply with good ideas. Because I think I already quoted Churchill, who said that the desire to believe something is much stronger than rational argument. I'd like to go on record and say that we as Christians, all the good arguments are on our side. What happens is, in the world today, all of our arguments, are criticized and so forth. But if you take the presuppositions of humanism and the cultural Marxism that we're talking about, and if you tease those out, what you will discover very quickly is that there is no rational basis for anything, including any values. You have to believe in God. But that doesn't mean that people are going to believe. I remember, and this I throw in as a bit of humor, I remember at a university, a guy said, "If you answer this question, I'll become a Christian." I said, "What is your question?" He says, "Can God make a mountain so big that he can't move it?" And I said, "I'll answer your question." I said, "No matter how big the mountain is, I can assure you that he can move it. Now, do you want to believe on Jesus? Get on your knees and get saved." Of course, you see, all these smoke screens are thrown out there, and I gave an extreme example. I know that there are many sincere people who struggle with doubt. And by the way, if you're listening today and you struggle with doubt, that's fine, as long as it's honest doubt. Honest doubt. We've all had it. God accepts it. God knows about it. Dishonest doubt, that's a different story.
Yeah. Earlier in our interview, you talked about the issue of propaganda and the role it's playing in this whole cultural Marxism. Can you expound on that a bit?
I'd love to expound on that. Propaganda, the purpose is to so shape people's view of reality that no matter how much evidence, counter evidence is produced, they will not change their minds. Hitler, and I refer to him because some of the radicals refer to him, because Hitler said that with the right use of propaganda, you can make heaven appear like hell and hell appear like heaven. So what you do is you couch what you are doing in language that hides a very sinister agenda. For example, when Hitler starved children, he called it putting them on a low-calorie diet. He didn't say, we're starving children. No. When he wanted to kill the Jews, he talked about the need to cleanse the land. The land needs to be cleansed. So what you do is you put it in language that sounds very lofty. When you have the killing of preborn infants, you don't say, "I believe that a mother has a right to kill her preborn infant." No politician says that. He says, "I think that she has the right to choose," or reproductive rights. So what you have to do is to hide what you are doing under this kind of language, and it is really sinister. And by the way, while I'm on the topic, it is not enough for the radical left to simply call that which is evil good. If they do that, that's fine, but that's only half the battle. The other half is they want to take that which is good and call it evil and celebrate the evil, and you'd better celebrate the evil with them, because if not, we're coming after you. So that's how propaganda works. And then you develop this cultural stream. The cultural stream is so powerful that nobody has the nerve to stand against it. And if they do stand against it, they will be very quickly vilified. And they are so afraid of vilification. So there are two emotions that are very important for the whole subject of propaganda. First of all is hate. Hitler said that hate is much more powerful than mere dislike. So what you have to do is you have to have a group to hate. In his day, it was initially the communists, then the Jews. The other emotion is fear. Don't you dare step out of line, because if you do, you're going to be vilified. You're going to be in trouble. You had better march to the drum, because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. So cultural streams are created. The media helps, of course, create those cultural streams. And woe to those who don't get on board.
Okay, our last question for the night. If things do not, excuse me, if things do not change in the direction of our nation, what do you foresee happening to Christians and our nation?
Well, I foresee the day when we're going to have to relearn some of the lessons of the past. We're going to have to relearn that the Church of Jesus Christ was not built on the American Constitution, though it is a remarkable document. When Jesus made the statement, "Upon this rock I will build my church," he was standing at Caesarea Philippi. If you've been to Caesarea Philippi, you know that that was the citadel of pagan religion. You look at all the caves that were there, those caves represented various gods and so forth. So right in the midst of paganism, Jesus said that he would build his church. What does that mean? I think we're going to probably have to go back to small groups. We're going to have to go back to connecting with one another, supporting one another. We're also going to see, as Niemöller said in Hitler's Germany, that there's a separation from the wheat and the chaff. And this is going to be very difficult for the American church, because we've always had governments that have been more or less in favor of Christianity. We've had laws that have favored Christianity. Since those days are closing in on us, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to remain faithful. But since this is the last question, I want to encourage people by saying, did you know it is not necessary to have freedom of religion in order to be faithful? Just ask the martyrs, and they will explain that to you, and they'll explain it to all of us. And my last word on this is this: we don't have to win on earth in order to win in heaven.
Good. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm not saying you have to occupy all that, but if you'd like to give us some final thoughts, this discussion's been an absolute delight. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, but give us some thoughts to go out with.
I think that one of the things we have to do is to make sure that we have separated ourselves unto God, that we are not so enmeshed with the world that we no longer are even aware of it. In my book, I make this statement under the sexualization of children. I have a chapter entitled that the cell phone in your teenager's hand will do more to inform his or her worldview than other things like an hour of church and an hour of Sunday school. When I think of the church of Sardis that I referred to earlier, I mentioned the fact that they no longer saw the world as their enemy. What I see happening in the Christian church today is we are more influenced by the culture than standing against the culture. And I wrote the book not so much to reclaim the culture. I don't think we can. I don't think we can go back to the same-sex marriage thing and undo that. So I didn't write it to reclaim the culture. I wrote it to reclaim the church. So you and I need to understand what it's like to stand for Jesus when standing for Jesus is unpopular, when we have the offense of the cross, and to take that offense of the cross. I think it was Bonhoeffer, who made the statement. He said that taking the cross into the world seems like a very good idea until you realize that the cross actually took Jesus to Golgotha, where he died. And then the idea doesn't seem to be as attractive. Now, we're living at a time when social media is so powerful. You open your mouth on one subject and you're vilified because everybody's angry about everything. When people shout at you, don't shout back. Paul says, when we are persecuted, we entreat, speak humbly, and as it says in Peter, give a reason for the hope that is within you with meekness and fear. So our job is not to come across as know-it-alls. We're not coming across as those who have no faults of our own. We come with humility, but we do come. Now, I know I ended on kind of a negative note about martyrdom just a few moments ago, Louis, so I'm going to end there by telling you this. A number of years ago, there was a converted Muslim who gave a lecture that I attended on Sharia law and what America would look like under Sharia law. And I have to tell you, it was very frightening. It was very eye-opening and frightening. Later on, I met him in a dining room and I said, let's have coffee together. And I asked him this question. I said, what is it that pastors should be doing in order to prepare for a future in which we no longer have freedoms, whether or not it's because of Islam or some other thing like the humanism that we've been talking about tonight, the cultural Marxism? And he took his finger and he pushed it into my chest and he said, God is calling you to teach your people how to die for the faith. Now, I graduated from seminary and I never knew that that would be part of my assignment. Now, this is a little alarmist, so I'm sure you'll get a phone call saying that Lutzer is alarmist, but let's dial that back a little bit. The question is, are we willing to, because that's not actually where we're at, I realize that, but are we willing to stand for Christ despite the consequences and to consider the consequences as a badge of honor rather than spending all of our time complaining? That would be one thing. The other thing is this. Remember when Jehoshaphat was confronted with, actually, yes, it was Jehoshaphat. He was confronted with an army in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And he looked up and he said, oh God, we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. Now, isn't it interesting, if you read the rest of the passage, what happened is they sent the choir into the battle first. I'm not making that up. It's in your Bible too. They sent the choir in, and as the choir sang praises to God, God gave the victory. So my last words to all those who are listening today is this: learn to give God praise, even when you don't understand his ways, even when what happens in the world is confusing. God did not abandon his sovereignty just because someone might be in political office that you did not vote for. God is still God. We are still his people, and he's going to see us through this. So be joyful, smile, and say, what an honor to live in this particular era in the great country of the United States.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Lutzer. I just want to let you guys know, if you haven't read this book, you will find it to be a fascinating read. We will not be silenced. So I just want to thank you again for taking time out from your schedule and being with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louis, and God bless. Thank you.
You too.